already by the end of the 2nd century, we have church fathers who are saying that there are 4 Gospels and only 4 Gospels, and these are the 4. The first person to do this is a church father named Irenaeus, who is writing around the year 180, who had a kind of an interesting argument. He said that since the gospel of Christ is spread through the 4 corners of the earth by the 4 winds of heaven, there have to be 4 gospels.
Right.
And so,
it's like saying there's 4 Marx Brothers because
that's right.
There should only be 4 Marx Brothers because of that. But then you brought up earlier the book of Revelation and how controversial that was at its time, that a lot of people at the time that the book was being included in the New Testament canon, there was a lot of people that tore it out or didn't want it or said this doesn't belong.
That's right. Well into the 4th century and beyond, we have leading church fathers, including the father of church history, Eusebius, who doubted whether the book of Revelation should be included. And in part, it was decided because eventually enough people became convinced that the book of Revelation was actually written by Jesus' disciple John, the son of Zebedee, and on those grounds it was included. As it turns out, that's probably not true. It probably wasn't written by John, the son of Zebedee, and so it got included, I guess you could say, on false premises, but nonetheless it got included, and other apocalypses that were competing for inclusion, such as the apocalypse of Peter, ended up getting left out.
Apocalypses are so interesting, and that's almost like an entirely different show to go down that road. But I find the differences between prophetic works and apocalyptic works very compelling, and I think it in our modern times we hear a lot of people talk about the coming apocalypse, and that they relate to the times of the Bible where apocalypses were popular. I don't think we're living in those kind of oppressed times, so I can't relate to that. I think we live in times where it really feels much more like the prophetic tradition, where where prophets were saying, "Hey, let's do this better," as opposed to the apocalyptic tradition that says we will be victorious over the people that are oppressing us.
I think you're exactly right, and one of the surprising things about the history of Christianity is what's going on right now, is where people who are not particularly oppressed are so taken with the book of Revelation and are expecting that the end is going to come right away. And one of the shocks that comes to people who approach the Bible, begin approaching the Bible from a historical point of view, is the realization that the book of Revelation, in fact, was not written to predict what's going to happen in the 21st century. It was written about the first century. And it was written in a context where people were desperately suffering, and it was trying to explain the suffering to those people, not predicting what was going to happen 2,000 years later.
You know, I had a conversation with somebody last summer at a boat dock, surprisingly, and we were talking about the Bible. I think I was wearing a collar at the time or whatever, but the conversation starts, and then he was rolling his 30-foot beautiful boat into the water, and which was being pulled by a Lincoln, whatever it was, beautiful SUV. And he was talking about the apocalypse, and he had a very apocalyptic worldview, and he was talking about himself as being oppressed. And I asked him, I said, "Who's oppressing you? That you're driving this beautiful boat into the water, and you got this great car, and I'm assuming a beautiful house to go with the boat and the car and a job to go along with it." I said, "Who's oppressing you?" And he said, "Democrats."
Right, we saw that on Teabag Day.
Yeah, but I thought that's so interesting that the Democrats, for some people, are what's associated with what would have been the Romans that were, putting all this downward pressure on worship in the classic, times of the Roman Empire.
No, but it's true that people. There's something about Christianity that a lot of very fervent Christians feel like they need to be oppressed, and that they are being oppressed somehow, and that they're suffering somehow, and that they're in the minority. I mean, here in Chapel Hill, my students feel like Christianity is this persecuted minority, when the reality is the Christians are the vast majority who make most of the decisions around here. And so the idea that Christianity is this persecuted, of course it is in some parts of the world, but not everywhere.
Well, I mean, or isn't it just that my type of Christianity and fill in the blank on what that my type is, that my type of Christianity is not dominant.
Well, and, sociologists have this notion of relative deprivation, which means that you might be doing extremely well and have a sailboat and a nice house and a nice car, but compared to the guy next door, you're really suffering.
Right. So, he's got it better than me because of whatever. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Well, tomorrow I'm preaching on the story of doubting Thomas. And I find that interesting in light of your book, Jesus Interrupted, in that I read something from Elaine Pagels once, who's, I believe, been on the show a couple of times, that she argues that the reason why Thomas is sort of consistently mocked as being a day late and a dollar short in the Gospel of John, that he's a doubter and he's eventually sort of rebuked by Jesus for doubting and for feeling the need to stick a finger in the wounds, that speaks to a time when the community of John was still very aware of the popularity of the Gospel of Thomas and the community of Thomas that were followers of Thomas. And that way, by writing John in such a way that it mocks Thomas, it was a way of mocking their rivals at the time. Where are you with that theory?
Yeah, that's one of Elaine's really controversial theories. She didn't come up with it herself. There have been a couple of scholars who proposed that before her, and I have to say it's a theory that hasn't persuaded most scholars of the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Thomas, because usually the Gospel of Thomas is dated about 30 years or so after the Gospel of John, and for this account to work, then the Gospel of Thomas needs to be floating around before the Gospel of John, and so there's a problem with the chronology, I think. But the basic idea is one that I completely agree with, is that these different communities are reacting to things that are going on in their social lives, and that affects how they tell their stories, whether stories about Thomas or about Jesus or anyone else, so that these stories are not disinterested accounts. The stories, in fact, are closely related to the theological and the social events going on in the communities.
So the idea of politicizing Thomas, the story of the doubting Thomas, is a way of was a way of discrediting the followers of Thomas that were popular at the time when the community of John was writing their gospel.
Yeah, that's the theory. And again, I actually disagree with the details of the theory, but the basic premise behind it is one that I agree with. I think there may be other ways of explaining why doubting Thomas is such a significant figure.
Why? What else? Why pick on Thomas like that?
Why pick? Right. So I think Thomas is set up as a kind of counterexample in the Gospel of John. He does believe once he sees the imprint of Jesus' crucifixion wounds, and I think what's going on in John is that John wants his readers to come to faith without having seen Jesus, and so Thomas is set up as the kind of counterexample that this is one kind of faith, but a better kind of faith is one that doesn't have to see.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for that. That'll help me my last point in my sermon for tomorrow. So good, you helped me tweak that last line a little bit. Let's go to the calls then. Coming up next hour for Bart Ehrman, Jesus Interrupted is the new book. It's the follow-up to the very popular Misquoting Jesus. Bart's been writing for years. His work on the Gnostic literature is something which I think people find definitive work on Gnosticism, both including the actual books themselves in one edition, but then also commentary on each one of those books in another edition. They are on my shelves. Revealing the Hidden Contradictions in the Bible and Why We Don't Know About Them. That's the subtitle for Jesus Interrupted. And all I ask when we get to the questions and comments coming up, that if you disagree with Bart, let's not turn this into ad hominem attacks and let's focus on what's actually being said and how you would respond to it on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet.